There was a time when British schools were not places where children were encouraged to ask questions, express themselves, or feel protected, but institutions built on obedience, silence, and unquestioned authority. In the 1970s, school rules were not guidelines or suggestions, but rigid laws of daily life, enforced without explanation and accepted by parents as simply how things were done, because schools were expected to prepare children for a strict and unforgiving world. What makes these rules so shocking today is not just that they existed, but that they were official, written into school policies, and carried out openly, often with the full support of the adults who were meant to protect the children living under them. Looking back now, it becomes clear just how much power schools once held, and how many of these rules would never be allowed anywhere near a classroom today. Number 1. Corporal punishment as an official school rule. In many British schools during the 70s, physical punishment was not an emergency measure or an unofficial practice carried out in secret, but a clearly defined part of the school's disciplinary system. Teachers were legally allowed to strike pupils, often using implements such as canes, straps, or rulers, and this was written into school rules as an appropriate response to misbehavior, lateness, disobedience, or even poor academic performance. Children knew exactly what these punishments involved because they were discussed openly, carried out regularly, and rarely questioned by parents, who often assumed that if a teacher had resorted to physical punishment, the child must have deserved it. There was no suggestion that this crossed a moral boundary because pain was framed as corrective rather than harmful, a quick and efficient way to maintain order in overcrowded classrooms where silence and compliance were valued above all else. From a modern perspective, the idea that a school could legally strike a child is deeply disturbing, but at the time, it was simply seen as part of maintaining discipline, something children were expected to endure without complaint. Number 2. Teachers deciding punishments without witnesses. Another rule that defined school life in the 70s was the complete lack of oversight when it came to discipline. Teachers were often allowed to decide punishments privately, without witnesses, without documentation, and without any requirement to explain their actions to parents or school leadership. A child could be taken out of class, brought into a separate room, and punished behind closed doors with no one else present to observe what happened or to intervene if things went too far. This arrangement placed enormous power in the hands of individual teachers, power that was rarely challenged because teachers were trusted implicitly and children were not considered reliable narrators of their own experiences. Today, safeguarding policies exist precisely to prevent this kind of unchecked authority, but back then, it was considered normal for discipline to happen out of sight, reinforcing the idea that what occurred between teacher and pupil was not to be questioned. Number 3. Public punishment in front of the entire class. Discipline was not always private, and in many cases it was deliberately made public in order to reinforce authority and discourage others from stepping out of line. Children could be called to the front of the classroom, criticized openly, shouted at, or physically punished in front of their peers, with the intention of making an example of them. This public humiliation was seen as an effective teaching tool because it reinforced social hierarchy and reminded everyone else of the consequences of disobedience. The emotional impact on the child was rarely considered because embarrassment was viewed as a necessary part of learning respect, something that would stay with them long after the punishment itself had ended. Today, deliberately humiliating a pupil would be recognized as harmful and unacceptable, but during that period, it was an accepted and even encouraged part of maintaining classroom order. Number 4. Detention without informing parents. In many schools, teachers had the authority to keep children behind after school as punishment, often without notifying parents in advance. A child might be expected home at a certain time, but instead would be kept in a classroom for an extra hour or more, writing lines or sitting in silence while parents remained unaware of where they were. This was justified as a school matter, something teachers believed they had the right to manage independently without parental involvement. Today, keeping a child after school without informing their parents would raise serious concerns, but at the time, it was simply part of the school's authority, and parents were expected to accept it without question. The child's safety, anxiety, or fear was rarely discussed because discipline was prioritized over communication. Number 5. Writing lines for hours as punishment. One of the most iconic school punishments of the era was writing lines, sometimes hundreds of times over, often for extended periods. Children might be forced to write the same sentence repeatedly, such as, "I must not talk in class," not as homework, but as a form of mental and physical exhaustion designed to reinforce obedience. This was not seen as excessive, but as productive, because it kept children quiet, occupied, and visibly punished. Today, this practice is widely criticized as ineffective and psychologically draining, but in the 70s, it was considered a harmless way to instill discipline without physical force. For many children, the memory of aching hands and endless repetition remains vivid, a reminder of how punishment was designed to wear them down rather than teach understanding. Number 6. Strict silence enforced throughout the school day. Silence was often treated as a virtue in British schools, and in some cases it was enforced not just during lessons, but throughout large portions of the school day. Children were expected to move quietly through corridors, eat lunch with minimal conversation, and remain silent during assemblies, sometimes for hours at a time. Speaking out of turn, whispering, or even making eye contact at the wrong moment could result in punishment, reinforcing the idea that children were to be seen and not heard. Today, educators recognize the importance of communication and social interaction, but back then, silence was equated with discipline and respect. For many pupils, school felt less like a place of learning and more like an exercise in endurance, where keeping quiet was often the primary goal. Number 7. Controlling hair, clothing, and physical appearance. Schools in the 70s exercised strict control over how children looked, often enforcing detailed rules about hair length, clothing, shoes, and even posture. Boys might be punished for hair that was considered too long, while girls were disciplined for skirts that did not meet exact length requirements. These rules were not about safety or comfort, but about conformity, reinforcing social norms and discouraging individuality. Today, such rigid control over appearance would likely be challenged by parents and students alike, but at the time, it was accepted as part of school discipline, something children were expected to comply with without argument. Number 8. Group punishment for individual behavior. Another rule that would be unacceptable today was the use of collective punishment. If one child misbehaved, the entire class might be punished, forced to stay behind, write lines, or miss break time, regardless of who was actually responsible. This approach was intended to encourage peer pressure and self-regulation, but it often fostered resentment and fear rather than cooperation. Modern educational practices explicitly discourage collective punishment, recognizing its unfairness, but during the 70s, it was a common and accepted disciplinary method. Number 9. Being physically removed from lessons. Physical force was sometimes used to remove children from classrooms, particularly if they were deemed disruptive or defiant. Teachers might grab a child by the arm, pull them out of their seat, or escort them forcibly into the corridor, actions that would now raise serious safeguarding concerns. At the time, however, this was seen as a necessary measure to maintain order, reinforcing the idea that teachers had complete authority over pupils' bodies as well as their behavior. Number 10. Expecting children to accept rules without explanation. Perhaps the most defining rule of all was that children were expected to accept school rules without explanation or discussion. Questions were often interpreted as challenges, and challenging authority was seen as a disciplinary issue in itself. Rules existed because teachers said they did, and children were not entitled to understand them, only to follow them. Today, education emphasizes critical thinking and dialogue, but in the 70s, obedience was considered the foundation of good behavior. Looking back, it becomes clear that British schools in the 70s were built around a system of control rather than care, obedience rather than understanding. These rules were not always enforced with malice, but they reflected a time when children were expected to adapt to authority rather than be protected from it. And while many people went on to lead successful lives despite these experiences, it is difficult to ignore how profoundly different childhood education has become, and how many of these rules would now be considered unacceptable. The most unsettling question is not whether these rules were effective, but why they were ever accepted in the first place.